The diner smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease, the kind of smell that sticks to your clothes and follows you home. 5 Hells Angels sat in a back booth at Merle's Diner off Route 9 in Ridgeway, Tennessee. Population 4,200. Their leather vests hung heavy with patches. Their boots left mud on the tile. The waitress behind the counter wouldn't look at them. The family in the corner booth pulled their daughter closer. The cook kept one hand near the phone. And in the middle of all that silence, a 74-year-old widow named Dorothy Mabel Sutter walked straight up to their table with a pot of coffee in one hand and a plate of biscuits she'd paid for herself in the other. She poured their cups without asking, set the plate down without flinching, looked the biggest one in the eye and said, "You boys look like you've been on the road a while. Biscuits are on me." Nobody in that diner moved. I knew what happened in the next 48 hours would bring 200 Hells Angels to the front porch of a woman who lived alone in a house she could barely afford, on a road most people had forgotten existed. They didn't come to take anything. They didn't come to cause trouble. They came because of a $3 tip and 7 words written on a napkin. 7 words that Christ himself couldn't have said better. But here's what nobody in that diner knew. Not the waitress, not the cook. That's not the family clutching their little girl like the world was ending. Nobody knew that Dorothy Sutter and the man sitting at the head of that table shared something that went back 34 years. A debt. A promise. A silence that had never been broken. This is a story about what happens when the people everyone fears turn out to be the only ones willing to protect a woman the whole town had given up on. And if you think you know where this is going, you don't. Dorothy Mabel Sutter was 74 years old. He stood 5'2", weighed 118 pounds, and had not missed a Sunday service at Ridgeway First Baptist in 41 years. She'd been widowed since 2006, when her husband Harold died of pancreatic cancer at 68. They'd had no children. She lived on $1,143 a month from Social Security. She volunteered at the town library every Tuesday and Thursday. She kept a vegetable garden that she shared with neighbors, even the ones who never said thank you. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for help. But on the road as Deacon. His real name was on the road as Deacon. His real name was James Allen Briggs. He was 58, 6'4", 247 pounds, with a beard that touched his chest and hands that could crush a walnut without trying. He'd lost his only son, a boy named Caleb, to a motorcycle accident on I-40 in 2011. He never spoke about it. He wore Caleb's dog tags under his vest, and on quiet nights when the fire was low, you could hear them clink against his chest like a second heartbeat. Deacon didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He had a stillness about him that made other men nervous. The kind of stillness that comes from having already survived the worst thing that can happen to a person. When Dorothy set those biscuits down, Deacon looked at her for a long time. His 4 brothers, Ratchet, Loom, Pike, and a young prospect they called Glass, watched him and said nothing. There was something in the air between Dorothy and Deacon. Something old, something heavy. The 5 of them ate in silence. When they finished, Dorothy brought the check. It came to $38.50. Deacon paid with 2 20s and told her to keep the rest. But when he looked down at the table, there was a napkin tucked under the sugar jar. On it, in shaky handwriting, Dorothy had written, "I still remember what you did. DS." And folded inside the napkin were 3 single-dollar bills. $3. Everything she could spare. Deacon read the napkin, folded it, put it in his vest pocket, right next to his son's dog tags. He didn't say a word. He stood, and all 5 of them walked out of that diner like the floor was made of glass. What happened next happened fast. But to understand why 200 men on motorcycles would ride 14 hours through the night for a woman they'd never met, you have to go back. Back to a night in 1991 when Dorothy Sutter was 40 years old and the world was a different place. In March of 1991, Dorothy and Harold were driving home from her mother's funeral in Knoxville. The service had been small, 11 people in a cinder-block church with water stains on the ceiling. Dorothy's mother, Irene, had been a seamstress who mended other people's clothes for 40 years and never once bought a new dress for herself. She died owning two things of value: a Singer's sewing machine from 1962 and a recipe for oatmeal cookies that she guarded like scripture. It was raining. Not a drizzle, a downpour. The kind that turns headlights into smears and makes the yellow line disappear. The wipers couldn't keep up. The road smelled like wet asphalt and pine, and the fog sat low in the hollows like something waiting. Harold was driving their old Ford pickup, knuckles pale on the wheel. Dorothy was in the passenger seat, holding a tin of her mother's oatmeal cookies, the last batch the woman ever baked, still warm when Dorothy had taken them from the counter that morning, still smelling like cinnamon and brown sugar in a kitchen she'd never stand in again. Somewhere past mile marker 112 on Route 9, the headlights caught something in the ditch. A motorcycle on its side, the chrome reflecting their lights in a wild flash. Next to it, lying in the mud with one arm thrown over his face, was a young man. He couldn't have been older than 24. His leg was bent at a bad angle, the kind of angle that makes your stomach drop just looking at it. His face was white. His lips were gray. He was shaking, not from cold but from shock. The deep, full-body tremors that come when the brain knows the body is in serious trouble. Harold wanted to keep driving. It was late, it was dark. And the boy was wearing a leather vest with patches that made Harold grip the steering wheel tighter. Could be trouble, Harold said. Could be a setup. Dorothy looked at her husband. She looked at the boy in the mud. She said, "Stop the truck." And when Harold hesitated, she said it again, quieter this time, which was worse. Harold knew that voice. It was the voice that didn't argue, because it didn't need to. They stopped. Dorothy climbed out into the rain, knelt in the mud in her funeral dress, the only black dress she owned, the same one she'd worn to say goodbye to her mother 3 hours earlier, and put her hand on the boy's forehead. He was burning up. His skin was slick with rain and sweat and something that smelled like rust. His leg was broken in 2 places, the bone pressing against the skin of his shin like it was trying to escape. He'd been lying there for over an hour. 17 cars had passed him. Not one had stopped. Not one. As that boy was James Allen Briggs. Before the road name, before the patch, before the reputation, before any of it. He was just a kid with a broken leg and no one in the world who cared enough to pull over. Dorothy held his head in her lap, while Harold drove 1.5 miles to the nearest payphone and called for an ambulance. She sat in the mud and the rain with this stranger's head cradled in her hands, and she talked to him. She told him about her mother, about the oatmeal cookies. You could tell the measure of a person by what they did when no one was watching. She took off her own coat, brown wool worn at the elbows, with a torn lining and a button missing on the left sleeve, and laid it over him, even though the rain soaked through her dress to her skin in seconds. The cold hit her like a wall. She didn't move. She kept talking. She kept her hand on his forehead, steady and warm, the way you'd hold a child through a fever. James tried to speak once. He said, "You don't have to." Dorothy said, "Hush." And that was the end of that conversation. The ambulance came 43 minutes later. By then, Dorothy's teeth were chattering so hard she couldn't speak. Her funeral dress was ruined, mud from the knees down, rain soaked through to the lining. Pasalan pandantan. From a gash on his calf that had been from a gash on his calf that had been sitting in standing water. His body temperature had dropped to 94 degrees. They loaded him into the ambulance. Dorothy stood in the rain and watched the red lights disappear down Route 9. Harold put his arm around her. She was shivering so hard she could barely walk back to the truck. She never told anyone what she'd done, not her neighbors, not her pastor, not a soul. That's the kind of woman she was. She didn't do things for the telling. James Briggs spent 6 weeks in the hospital. 3 surgeries, 3 pins in his left tibia, and a staph infection that nearly took the leg anyway. When he got out, walking with a limp he'd carry the rest of his life, he went looking for the woman who'd saved him. But Harold and Dorothy had moved by then. Harold got a job at the lumber mill in Ridgeway, 80 miles south. There was no forwarding address, no phone listing. This was 1991. No internet, no social media, no way to find a quiet couple who didn't want to be found. James asked at every gas station, every church, every post office in a 50-mile radius. He drove that stretch of Route 9 a dozen times, hoping he'd see the same Ford pickup. He left his name and number at the diner near mile marker 112, not in case anyone knew a woman named Dorothy who drove a truck and wore a brown wool coat. Nobody did. He never found her, but he never forgot her. He made a vow, sitting in that hospital bed with the fluorescent lights humming above him and the smell of antiseptic burning his nose and the windows showing nothing but a gray parking lot in the rain. He said it out loud to an empty room. If I ever find her, I'll repay it. Whatever it costs, however long it takes. He kept her coat. That's the brown wool coat with the torn lining and the missing button. He kept it folded in a cedar chest for 34 years. Every time he moved, and he moved a lot in those early years, chasing work and trouble in equal measure, the coat went with him. He lost apartments, he lost jobs, he lost his marriage and his pride and, eventually, his son. But he never lost that coat. It was the only soft thing he owned. The only proof that once, on the worst night of his life, as a stranger had knelt in the mud and chosen him. Now here is where the silence breaks. Here is where the road turns. After Dorothy left that napkin on the table, Deacon made one phone call. He called a man named Garrett Cole, president of the Ridgeway chapter of the Angels, and asked him one question. What do you know about Dorothy Sutter's situation? The answer took 4 minutes and changed everything. For the last 3 years, our Dorothy had been under the care, or what passed for care, of a man named Lewis Hathaway. Lewis was 61 years old. He wore pressed khakis and a belt with a brass buckle. He sang in the church choir. He coached Little League for 12 years. He organized the town's annual Veterans Day pancake breakfast. He was the kind of man people called a good man without ever really looking at him. Lewis had become Dorothy's unofficial financial manager after Harold died. As he showed up the day after the funeral with a store-bought pie and a yellow legal pad. He sat at her kitchen table, smelling like Old Spice and peppermint, and said, "Dorothy, you shouldn't have to worry about money right now. Let me help." His voice was soft. His handshake was warm. He looked her in the eye when he spoke, and he never rushed her. He helped her with the bills. He drove her to doctor's appointments in his clean Buick with the leather seats. And he brought her groceries on Fridays. Always the same things. Always carried in with both hands. Always set on the counter with a little nod like it was his privilege. He remembered that she liked Granny Smith apples and peppermint tea. The town thought he was a saint. Pastor Whitfield mentioned him by name in a sermon about Christian generosity. The Ridgeway Gazette ran a photo of him at the Veterans Day breakfast, flipping pancakes with a spatula in one hand and a flag pin on his collar. And he was bleeding her dry. Before you hear how this ends, If you're watching from Ridgeway or anywhere in Tennessee, drop your location in the comments. And if this story's already got your chest tight, hit that subscribe button now. Because what Deacon did next, what 200 bikers did on a Wednesday morning at 6 a.m., is something you will not forget. Stay with me. It started small, a withdrawal here, a fee there. Lewis told Dorothy the electric company had raised its rates. He told her the property tax had gone up. He told her the insurance premium doubled. None of it was true. Over 3 years, he siphoned $23,400 from her account in small, steady withdrawals. $150 here, $200 there, never more than $300 at a time, never enough to trigger a flag at the bank. He kept a separate ledger, a fake one, that he showed Dorothy whenever she had questions. The numbers always added up on paper. They never added up in reality. He convinced her to sign a power of attorney. Yeah, you're ever not feeling well. It's what you're ever not feeling well. It's what Harold would have wanted. She signed it. She didn't read the fine print. She trusted him. Then he began to isolate her. He told Martha Gibbons, Dorothy's closest friend, that Dorothy was having memory problems and preferred not to have visitors. He told the librarian that Dorothy had decided to stop volunteering because the drive was too much. He told Pastor Whitfield that Dorothy felt embarrassed about her finances and didn't want people asking questions. One by one, he cut every thread that connected her to the world outside her house. He did it gently. He did it with concern in his voice and sadness in his eyes. He did it the way a man cuts a fence, one wire at a time, so the animal doesn't notice until it's already penned. And he screened her phone calls. He moved her mail to a P.O. box that only he checked. He started coming by the house unannounced, not to help, but to watch, to see if anyone else had been there, to make sure the walls he'd built around her were still standing. Dorothy knew something was wrong. Her money didn't stretch the way it used to. She couldn't afford her blood pressure medication some months. She ate canned soup 5 nights a week. Chicken noodle, tomato, chicken noodle, tomato. And on Fridays, cream of mushroom, because it felt like a treat. She lost 11 pounds in 8 months. Her dresses hung loose on her shoulders. But every time she asked Lewis about the numbers, he smiled that calm smile, the one that never reached his eyes, and said, "Dorothy, you're just forgetting things again. It's normal at your age." He made her doubt herself. That was the cruelest part. Not the money, not the isolation, the doubt. He took a woman who had survived 74 years with her mind sharp and her back straight. And he made her wonder if she was going crazy. She stopped asking questions. She stopped going to the library. She stopped tending the garden. The tomato plants she'd grown every summer for 30 years died on the vine. She stopped pressing her dresses. She stopped opening the curtains. The woman who had knelt in the mud in a rainstorm to save a stranger's life was sitting alone in her kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, staring at a bank statement she couldn't understand, wondering if she was losing her mind. Lewis controlled the information. Lewis controlled the access. Lewis controlled the narrative. And because he showed up to church every Sunday with a casserole and a handshake and that warm, steady voice, the whole town believed him. Nobody looked at Dorothy and asked why her garden was dead. Deacon listened to all of this on the phone. He didn't interrupt. He didn't swear. When Garrett finished talking, there was a long pause, the kind of pause that makes the air feel heavier. Then Deacon said 5 words. "Call everyone. Wednesday morning." The call went out Monday night. It traveled through 14 chapters across 4 states. It moved through text chains and bar conversations and gas station parking lots. No one asked why. When Deacon called, you answered. Wednesday at 5:47 a.m., the first rumble hit Ridgeway. It started as a vibration in the ground. Dorothy felt it in her kitchen floor before she heard it. She was making coffee, the way she did every morning, standing at the counter in her housecoat and slippers. The spoon in her cup began to rattle against the ceramic. Then the sound. Low at first, like distant thunder. But it didn't fade. It grew. It built. It filled the air like a living thing. The windows buzzed. The picture frames on the wall shifted. Dorothy walked to her front door and opened it. The road in front of her house, a 2-lane blacktop that nobody used unless they were lost, was filled with motorcycles. Not 5, not 20. 214 to be exact. They lined both sides of the road for a quarter-mile in each direction. The engines idled in unison, a sound so deep it settled in your bones and stayed there. Deacon was at the front. He dismounted. I removed his sunglasses and walked up her porch steps with something tucked under his arm. Behind him, 213 men and women in leather sat on their bikes in perfect silence. The engines cut at once. The quiet that followed was louder than the noise had been. Dorothy looked at him. Her hand went to her mouth. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She was not a woman who cried in front of people. "Ma'am," Deacon said, "my name is James Allen Briggs. You saved my life on Route 9 in March of 1991, and I've been looking for you for 34 years. He unfolded the brown wool coat, the one with the torn lining and the missing button, and draped it over her shoulders. "This is yours," he said, "and so are we." By 8 a.m., Garrett Cole and 2 club members who happened to have backgrounds in forensic accounting were sitting at Dorothy's kitchen table with every bank statement, every bill, and every document Lewis Hathaway had ever touched. They found everything, every withdrawal, and every forged signature, every lie. By noon, the Ridgway County Sheriff's Department had a file on their desk with 147 pages of evidence. Lewis Hathaway was arrested at 2:15 p.m. in the church parking lot, still wearing his choir robe. He didn't resist. He couldn't. There were 43 bikers in that parking lot, standing silently beside their machines, watching. The woman at the bank who had processed Dorothy's withdrawals without question came forward that afternoon. Yet she sat in the sheriff's office for 2 hours, her hands shaking, explaining how she'd noticed the pattern but assumed Lewis had authorization. The neighbor who had noticed Dorothy losing weight but said nothing brought over a casserole and couldn't look her in the eye. She stood on the porch and said, "I should have come sooner." And Dorothy, because she was Dorothy, said, "You're here now." The pastor who had praised Lewis from the pulpit called Dorothy to apologize, and his voice cracked on the phone. He said he felt responsible. Dorothy told him she didn't blame him. She told him Lewis had fooled everyone. She said it without bitterness, without anger, with the same quiet dignity she'd carried her whole life. Everyone had something to say now. Everyone had known something was off, but hadn't wanted to look too closely. That's the thing about small towns. People see everything, but they only talk about what's comfortable. Now, the bikers didn't say a word to any of them. They didn't have to. Their presence said it all. 200 people had driven through the night for a woman they'd never met. And the whole town of Ridgway couldn't be bothered to walk across the street. At 4 p.m., Deacon sat on Dorothy's porch with her. The afternoon light was gold and low, cutting through the oak trees and laying long shadows across the yard. He reached into his vest and pulled out a challenge coin. Brass, heavy, ill-worn smooth on the edges from years of being carried. On one side was the chapter insignia. On the other, stamped in block letters, were the words, "Family Protects." He placed it in Dorothy's palm and closed her fingers around it. "You're family now," he said. "That means you're never alone again. That's not a courtesy. That's a code." Dorothy looked at the coin. She looked at the road full of motorcycles. She looked at a man she'd last seen bleeding in a ditch 34 years ago. A boy whose head she'd held in her lap on the worst night of both their lives. "I kept your coat," she said. Her voice was steady. "But I never knew if you made it." "I made it," Deacon said, "because of you." 6 weeks later, Dorothy Sutter's bank account had been restored to $24,740. The $23,400 Lewis had stolen plus $1,340 in restitution ordered by the court. Lewis Hathaway pleaded guilty to elder financial abuse, fraud, and exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Yet he was sentenced to 4 years at Brushy Mountain. The day of the sentencing, not a single person from Ridgeway First Baptist sat on his side of the courtroom. Dorothy went back to the library. She shelved books on Tuesdays and read aloud to children on Thursdays, picture books about animals and adventure, the kind with big illustrations and happy endings. She went back to the garden. She planted new tomatoes, new peppers, new basil. She put in a row of sunflowers along the fence. The tall kind that face the road, the kind that make you slow your car down just to look. She started a Tuesday morning coffee group at Merle's Diner with 3 other widows from her street. Martha Gibbons, Pauline Beck, and a quiet woman named Jean, who had lost her husband to black lung in 2019. They met at 8 a.m. They sat in the same booth where 5 bikers had sat 7 weeks earlier. They ordered the same coffee. They talked about nothing and everything. And sometimes they just sat together and watched the traffic pass, and that was enough. Every second Saturday, Deacon rode down from Nashville, 187 miles each way. He parked his bike in her driveway, walked up the same porch steps, and they drank coffee together for exactly 1 hour. Sometimes they talked about Harold, or about Caleb, or about roads they'd driven and places they'd been. Sometimes they sat in silence, watching the sunflowers bend in the wind. And the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that only exists between people who don't need to prove anything to each other. Dorothy kept the challenge coin on her nightstand, right next to Harold's photograph and a small glass jar of dried lavender from her garden. She kept the brown wool coat on a hook by her front door, the same door she used to be afraid to open. Now she opened it every morning. She opened it wide. Some debts can't be measured in dollars. Us will tell you to be afraid of the man in the dark when no one else is watching. The world will tell you to be afraid of the man in leather on the highway. The world will tell you to lock your doors and cross the street and hold your children close. The world will tell you the rough-looking stranger is the one you should worry about. But Dorothy Sutter will tell you different. Ammejan stood was on her own front porch. Wrapped stood was on her own front porch, wrapped in a 34-year-old wool coat with a torn lining. Surrounded by 200 people, the whole town had been afraid to look in the eye. If this story hit you somewhere in the chest, you're not alone. Drop a like. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's been quiet too long, someone who's carrying a weight they shouldn't have to carry alone. And remember this. The people who show up when it costs them something, those are the ones who mean it. That's the code, that's the road, that's family.